The Supreme Court held oral arguments yesterday in one of the most important cases in this country's history. It's a case that will decide whether, under the U.S. Constitution, states are allowed to outlaw child sterilization and mutilation in the name of gender ideology. Now, in any other generation, this question would not have made it to the Supreme Court in the first place. The question itself would have been bewildering to anyone who heard it, for the simple reason that sterilizing, castrating, and mutilating children is one of the greatest evils imaginable. Even some of the most barbaric civilizations throughout history wouldn't even contemplate it. You don't need a law degree to understand that. You don't need a convoluted analysis under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. You just need to be a moral person. You need to be sane and have a basic working understanding of human biology. Now, one of the main reasons that we've come to this point is that trans activists have successfully intimidated everyone else into silence. Trans activists aren't capable of making coherent or rational arguments in defense of child butchery because child butchery is indefensible. But they're very capable of shouting down anyone who opposes their ideology. And predictably, that's what they tried to do to me when I spoke yesterday at the rally outside the Supreme Court. Here's part of my remarks in front of the Capitol, just to give you an idea of what the scene was like. Here it is.
This case is about the rights of children. It's about the right of a child to be protected from the... That's what it's about. Children have the constitutional right, the human right, the God-given right to live and grow and learn about themselves and the world without being indoctrinated and exploited by people who reject the fundamental realities of existence. Children have a right to go through phases, to have moments of and discomfort in their own bodies, just like every generation of children before them, without that being seized upon as a pretense to do to their bodies.
Now, as you can probably tell, trans activists were shouting into megaphones the entire time that I was speaking. It happened to the other speakers, too. They were doing it the whole time. The trans activists showed up in large numbers outside the court with the intention of making it difficult for us to speak and be heard. And that's what I expected would happen. It is what happened. Leftists are very good at mobilizing protesters to show up and be as obnoxious as possible. They're certainly much better at that than we are. But they're still losing this fight. They're losing in the state legislatures. They're losing in the culture. And after yesterday's oral arguments, it's pretty clear that they're about to lose in the Supreme Court as well. Every indication we have at this point is that a majority of the justices will vote to uphold Tennessee's ban on child mutilation. And if that happens, it won't just protect millions of children in Tennessee and many other states that have implemented similar bans. It will also clear the way for a national ban on these grotesque practices, which have ruined the lives of untold numbers of children. The reason we can be confident in the outcome of this case is that one by one, each of the arguments from the Biden DOJ and the ACLU collapsed under questioning from the conservative justices in the majority. And when the liberal justices tried their best to defend gender ideology, somehow they only managed to make matters even worse. And we predicted that something like this would happen. When they can't shout you down, when they actually have to construct arguments and respond to objections, trans activists tend to fall apart pretty quickly. And that was the case for the ACLU's lead attorney in this case, Chase Strangio, a female who, quote, identifies as a man. And to give you some idea of the kind of person Chase Strangio is, she's posted a variety of emotionally charged, unhinged content on social media over the years, including this video in which she declared F the court. So she's not exactly out of central casting for the job of arguing in front of the court. Watch.
So for Pride, let us recognize that reproductive justice is trans justice, is queer justice. Our liberation is not going to come from the courts. It is not going to come from Congress. It is going to come from us. It's going to come from our histories of knowing exactly how to take care of each other, how to get each other health care, how to say unjust laws, and this court, quite frankly. Because that's not where justice is going to live. So I am excited to be out here with all of you. I'm excited to build upon the histories of liberation and resistance that have been centuries in the making.
So this is the esteemed orator that the ACLU selected to argue in front of the Supreme Court yesterday. Someone who says F the court and then uploads it on social media. Now, in case it's not obvious, this is yet another DEI selection. Chase Strangio identifies as trans, so they put her up there to get a headline out of it. She's the first trans attorney to argue at the Supreme Court, and so on. that's the logic. And it didn't go very well. Like all DEI hires, Chase Strangio crashed and burned multiple times. At one point during oral arguments, for example, Justice Alito pressed Strangio on the question of whether so-called gender-affirming treatments actually help prevent suicides in children. And this is a question that goes to the very heart of the trans agenda, as well as the merits of the case. A core argument in the ACLU's petition that was filed with the Supreme Court is that child sex changes are necessary because they save lives. It's also one of the most common refrains we hear from trans activists all the time. This is a life-saving medicine, they say. They use that line, would you rather have a living son or a dead daughter, implying that it's better to castrate a child than lose that child to suicide. This is maybe their number one argument, in fact. Now, they don't use this line because it's accurate or grounded in reality. They use it because it's often very effective. It's a tool of emotional blackmail, and it works, or it has in the past. And if you don't challenge the premise of the question, which is false, you might fall for it and give the trans activists what they want. But Alito didn't accept the false premise, and Strangio had no follow-up, had no way of dealing with that. Instead, she admitted that there's no evidence that child sex changes, quote unquote, actually reduce the number of suicides in children. Pretty remarkable moment. Watch.
But on page 195 of the CAST report, it says, there is no evidence that gender affirmative treatments reduce suicide.
What I think that is referring to is there is no evidence in the studies that this treatment reduces completed suicide. And the reason for that is completed suicide, thankfully and admittedly, is rare, and we're talking about a very small population of individuals with studies that don't necessarily have completed suicides within them. However, there are multiple studies, long-term longitudinal studies, that do show that there is a reduction in suicidality, which I think is a positive outcome to this treatment.
So this is what always happens when trans activists have to answer a follow-up question. Every single time, this is what you get. They'll make some outrageous claim, and then you ask for evidence, and they don't have any. They'll shout you down if they can. Or in this context, because they can't shout you down at the Supreme Court, they're forced to admit that they were lying, that it's not true. And again, you can't emphasize enough, this is one of the key claims of their whole case, that the lawyer arguing the case just admitted was false. Now, what happened here is that Justice Alito noticed that the ACLU barely mentioned the CAST report in their brief before the court. They put the CAST report in a footnote and didn't address it in any meaningful way. So Alito picked up on the fact that they wanted to bury the evidence they didn't like. And then they were called out on they were called out on it, and they had to admit that the CAST report was devastating to their whole argument. Here we have the ACLU's lead attorney admitting that according to the data, so-called gender-affirming care doesn't actually reduce the rates of suicide among young people. So what does this gender-affirming care, quote-unquote, accomplish? Chase Strangio goes on to claim that it reduces the number of young people who say they want to kill themselves, but it doesn't really make sense either. I mean, if you really did have some magical treatment that greatly reduced the number of people who say they want to kill themselves, you'd think that naturally the number of suicides would go down too, but apparently that's not happening. It's enough to make you wonder if anything this Chase Strangio person is saying is remotely true. It also raises questions about how exactly we're measuring the suicidality of young people. But even if this new argument did somehow make sense, it's still a massive retreat from the previous position of the Biden DOJ, the ACLU, trans activists. They claimed for years that child sex changes were necessary because they were life-saving, and now they're finally admitting that they have no evidence to support that contention. They expected us to believe in absurdity that disfiguring a child would save his life somehow on the basis of statistics and expert opinions that they were completely fabricating. This was a devastating moment for the ACLU. The DOJ, the trans agenda, also in general, a devastating moment. And the reason the ACLU and the Biden DOJ are almost certainly going to lose this case, although we don't want to count our chickens before they hatch, but it looks very likely that they're going to lose, is that the Supreme Court in its current makeup is reluctant to override the democratic will of the voters on account of experts and data that are clearly unreliable, if not totally invented. And what Strangio just admitted is that the experts and the data are indeed highly unreliable, if not outright lies. In his questions during oral arguments, John Roberts made it clear that this is a big problem for the government's case. The alleged consensus among medical organizations on this issue has collapsed, largely because of countries like Sweden and the UK. And that makes it very hard for the Supreme Court to overturn the democratic will of the people. Justice Kavanaugh made the same point. Listen.
If it's evolving like that and changing, and England's pulling back and Sweden's pulling back, it strikes me as, pretty heavy yellow light, if not red light, for this court to come in, the 9 of us, and to constitutionalize the whole area when the rest of the world, or at least the countries that have been at the forefront of this, are pumping the brakes on this kind of treatment because of concerns about the risks.
That's a good way of putting it, and that's what the ACLU and the Biden administration wants. As Kavanaugh points out, the whole rest of the world, they either never engaged in this madness to begin with, or they're pulling back from it. And the Biden administration, the ACLU, they want to go the opposite way, and put this into the Constitution. Engrave it in the Constitution. You have that these doctors have a constitutional right to do this to kids. Now, the other major problem for the DOJ and the ACLU is that, in their understanding, anyone can become transgender at any moment. I mean, that's the entire concept underpinning gender ideology. If you want to be a woman, just say you're a woman, and it's true. If you change your mind at any point, you can switch back. No problem. Somebody could be a man and a woman on the same day if they want. Now, this is an attractive proposition for, narcissistic people who think that they can play God over themselves and biology. But practically in this case, it creates a lot of issues. And that's because a key argument that the ACLU and the Biden administration are making is that Tennessee's ban violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution on the grounds that it supposedly treats people differently depending on an immutable characteristic, namely their sex. So here's the ACLU's argument. They say that under this law, if you're a boy and you need puberty blockers to address a medical issue like precocious puberty, then you can get puberty blockers. But if you're a girl and you want puberty blockers in order to stall your physical development, in order to affirm your sense of gender identity, you can't get them. Therefore, they say the law is discriminating on the basis of sex. Now, there are about 4 major problems with this, more than 4, but the whole thing is nonsensical. But just to highlight 4, first of all, the purpose of the medical intervention is vastly different in those 2 cases I just mentioned. The boy in that example wants to get puberty blockers in order to address the condition of an abnormally premature puberty, while the perfectly healthy girl wants puberty blockers to suppress the normal and healthy functions and development of her body. These are not just different reasons for getting the puberty blockers, they are like opposite reasons. So the law is treating people differently here, but not based on their sex. It's treating them differently based on the kind of treatment they want and the reason they want it. And it's normal for a law to distinguish between situations like that because certain kinds of medical interventions are far more dangerous than others. They're not the same thing. Okay, if a child has cancer, the benefits of giving the child chemotherapy probably outweighs the risks. If a child doesn't have cancer, then giving the child chemotherapy would be child abuse. It would be torture. It's the exact same procedure, but in one case it's okay, another case it's not. How could that be the case? Well, because in one case it's treating a legitimate illness, and in the other case it isn't. So pretty obvious distinction there. Another problem here is that in every other equal protection case that involves sex discrimination, one gender can clearly say that they're losing out, in some way. There's usually some obvious injury to a member of one gender and not the other. So, for example, maybe a man is denied a job while a woman is hired solely on the basis of sex, something like that. But that's not the case here. The Tennessee law applies to both girls and boys equally. It's not negatively affecting either group. In fact, it's positively affecting everybody. It's protecting all kids regardless of sex, but also regardless, it applies the same regardless of your sex. And that was an observation that Clarence Thomas made at one point during the arguments. Additionally, Clarence Thomas also pointed out that, if you think about it, what the ACLU is seeking in this case would actually produce its own form of sex discrimination. The ACLU wants the plaintiff in the case, a girl who identifies as a boy, to get drugs that would enable her to undergo a, quote, traditional male puberty. But if the ACLU won the case, boys wouldn't get the same result. They wouldn't be able to get puberty blockers to undergo a male puberty. And as Clarence Thomas pointed out, using the ACLU's own logic, that's a form of sex discrimination. Natural disasters are becoming more frequent and devastating, folks. From the Maui fires to Hurricane Helene, we're seeing entire towns wiped out in 24 hours with barely any warning. What happens? People are left without basic resources, scrambling to survive. Now, I know you're thinking, it won't happen here. That's exactly what everyone thinks until they're in the middle of a catastrophe. Being prepared isn't just smart, it's essential. That's where the wellness company's emergency kit comes in. These aren't your run-of-the-mill first aid kits. We're talking about a personalized mini pharmacy right in your own home. No more relying on overworked doctors or understocked pharmacies when disaster strikes. Bacterial infections, staph, bite wounds, UTIs, strep throat, respiratory illnesses, these kits have you covered. It's like having a doctor in your pocket, minus the liberal indoctrination from med school. Look, you keep a fire extinguisher handy, right? Well, consider this your medical fire extinguisher. It's not paranoia, it's preparedness. Here's how it works. Just fill out a form online, a pharmacist reviews it, and boom, simple as that. Your kit arrives in 2 weeks. It even comes with a medical board approved guidebook. It's that simple. And right now, when you go to urgentcarekit.com/Walsh and use promo code Walsh, you'll save $60 plus free shipping. That's urgentcarekit.com/Walsh to save $60. This is Preparedness Simplified. Invest in your family's self-managed insurance plan today. urgentcarekit.com/Walsh. USA residents only. The fourth fatal problem with the ACLU's argument is that, as Justice Alito observed, trans identity is not an immutable characteristic. Through the miracle of gender ideology, somebody can supposedly become a man in the morning and then revert back to being a woman in the evening. In other words, so-called trans status is not fixed. And only immutable fixed characteristics like race can qualify for protection under our civil rights laws. That's why this was such a big moment in oral arguments yesterday. Strangio was eventually forced to admit that, indeed, trans identification is not an immutable characteristic. Another huge moment. Listen to this.
Does the category of does transgender status apply to individuals who are gender fluid?
I think that the distinguishing characteristic is to have a birth sex that does not align with, or a gender that does not align with one's birth sex. So it may include people who have different understandings of their gender identity, but I think it is still the distinguishing characteristic of a birth sex and a gender identity that are incongruent.
Are there individuals who are born male, assigned male at birth, who at one point identify as female, but then later come to identify as male, and likewise for individuals who are assigned female at birth, at some point identify as female, identify as male, but later come to identify as female? Are there not such people?
There are such people. I agree with that, Justice.
So it's not an immutable characteristic, is it?
Well, I think people's understanding of it shifts, but the evidence shows that there is at least a strong underlying basis. And I think the normative reason for that particular consideration is whether or not this is something that someone should or could change, and whether they should have to change it in order to receive constitutional protections. And I think transgender status squarely fits within.
So once again, it all devolves into word salad, and once again, one of the pivotal aspects of the ACLU's case just absolutely crumbled. I mean, they had to admit that trans status is not immutable. That alone means you lose. If that's the case, which of course it is, if it's the case that trans status is not immutable, and that's accepting the ACLU's and the trans activists' own argument, like accepting that, just letting them tell us what it means to be trans, according to them, even, it's not immutable. So the whole case is out the window. So we've already heard 2 or 3 examples where if you just took just like one moment, just any one of these moments isolated would destroy the whole case. But then you add them all together and you have just an absolute meltdown, which means that Chase Strangio's big day at the Supreme Court didn't go very well, to put it mildly. No one could have seen that coming, but that's what happened. Actually, it's pretty clear that everyone saw it coming, which is why the Biden administration Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar did most of the arguing yesterday. In her remarks, she conceded that some of this gender-affirming care, so-called, results in the sterilization of children, but she said it was worth it. Anyway, here's her reasoning.
You mentioned fertility and regret, and I'd like to take both of those concerns head on. I do want to acknowledge that there is evidence to suggest that gender-affirming care with respect to hormones can have some impacts on fertility. I think you have to recognize that the effect of denying this care is to produce irreversible physical effects that are consistent with their birth sex, because they have to go through puberty before they turn 18. So essentially what this law is doing is saying we're going to make all adolescents in the state develop the physical secondary sex characteristics consistent with their gender or with their sex assigned at birth, even though that might significantly worsen gender dysphoria, increase the risk of suicide, and I think critically make it much harder to live and be accepted in their gender identity as an adult. Because if you're requiring someone to undergo a male puberty and they develop an Adam's apple, that's going to be hard to reverse, and they're more likely to be identified as transgender and subject to discrimination and harassment as adults.
Just utter nonsense. This, of course, is the so-called forced puberty argument. She's saying that Tennessee's law is what forces children to undergo puberty, even though they might not want to. She says, quote, what this law is doing is saying we're going to make all adolescents in the state develop the physical secondary sex characteristics consistent with their gender or with their sex assigned at birth. Well, no, the law in Tennessee isn't making anyone develop secondary sex characteristics. That's just nature, okay? That's what happens naturally. That's the normal series of events that occurs as children get older. I mean, it's no different than saying that, you know, if you won't let a 9-year-old get a nose job, that you're forcing the 9-year-old to have the nose that she was born with. It's like, no, we didn't create the nose. That's just your nose. And what we're saying is 9 years old is too young to go get cosmetic surgery. So what the Biden administration wants to do is to interrupt the natural development of children with completely untested chemicals that will sterilize them. They're trying to reframe our position as somehow the unnatural one because they recognize at some level that it's grotesque and extremely dangerous to conduct medical experiments on children. And so they have to reduce themselves to these kinds of totally vacuous and absurd arguments. In her questioning, Sonia Sotomayor pretended not to realize all this. She tried to claim that there's no difference between castrating a child and giving a child an aspirin. Watch.
Cannot eliminate the risk of detransitioners. So it becomes a pure exercise of weighing benefits versus risk. And the question of how many minors have to have their bodies irreparably harmed for unproven benefits is one that is best left.
I'm sorry, counselor. Every medical treatment has a risk, even taking aspirin. There is always going to be a percentage of the population under any medical treatment that's going to suffer a harm. So the question in my mind is not, do policymakers decide whether one person's life is more valuable than the millions of others who get relief from this treatment? The question is, can you stop one sex from the other?
This is one of those moments where we're all supposed to pretend that Sonia Sotomayor isn't a complete idiot. We're all supposed to pretend that she's a wise Latina who adds much needed diversity to the court. It's all very degrading and intentionally so. A JV debate team would disband in shame if they ever made the argument you just heard there. And this is the highest court in the land. Okay, aspirin is one of the most tested medicines on the planet. We know every side effect. We have all the information there is to have about it. We know what ages can safely take it, what ages cannot. We know everything about what the dosage is supposed to be. Aspirin does not pretend to change an immutable characteristic like your sex. There is no aspirin report in the UK that shows that there's no benefit to taking aspirin. But the Sonia Sotomayor, taking an aspirin and castrating yourself in order to affirm a subjective gender identity are the same thing. No differences that she can detect. But Sotomayor didn't stop there. As a noted feminist, Sotomayor went on to compare a girl with unwanted hair to a girl with, quote, unwanted breasts. She actually drew that comparison without missing a beat. And then the lawyer for the state of Tennessee informed her that, those are two very different things. Watch.
The question is, can you stop one sex from the other? One person of one sex from another sex? from receiving that benefit. So if the medical condition is unwanted hair by a 9-year-old boy who can receive estrogen for that, because at 9 years old, if he has hair, he gets laughed at and picked on, and his puberty is coming in too early. But a girl who has unwanted hair says, or has unwanted breasts, or a boy at that age can get that drug, but the other can't. That's the sex-based difference. It's not the medical condition is the same. And
we don't
but
agree.
You're saying one sex is getting it and the other's not.
We do not agree that the medical condition is the same. We do not think that giving puberty blockers to a 6-year-old that has started precocious puberty is the same medical treatment as giving it to a minor who wants to transition. Those are not the same medical treatment.
Yeah, right. I mean, yes, it's not the same. And this is really has always been the primary challenge of debating the left on this issue, on so many other issues too, but particularly on this one, that their arguments are so dumb, they are so stupid, they are so mind-bogglingly off base that you don't even know where to begin in responding to them. They can kind of you might fall into a kind of stupefied silence when you hear stuff like this, because when she says that, it's like hair and breasts are two different things. I mean, can we start with the fact that one is a physical part of your body that if you get rid of that part of your body, it will not grow back, but hair does? So we could start with that, Same reason that like cutting your hair and cutting off your arm are not the same things. Well, we take children to barbershops to cut off their hair. Why couldn't we cut off their arm? Answer that now, counselor. Now, if you understand these oral arguments as a competition among the DEI justices to out-dumb each other, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. That's especially true after you see what Ketanji Brown Jackson did. She went ahead and compared Tennessee's law to a ban on interracial marriage. This is the same justice who, lest we forget, couldn't even define the word woman during her confirmation hearing, and now she's saying that, in effect, there's no difference between protecting kids from castration and preventing white people from marrying black people. Watch.
Being drawn by the statute. That was sort of like the starting point. The question was whether it was discriminatory because it applied to both races and it wasn't necessarily invidious or whatever. But, as I read the statute here, the case here, the court starts off by saying that Virginia is now one of 16 states which prohibit and punish marriages on the basis of racial classifications. And when you look at the structure of that law, it looks in terms of, you can't do something that is inconsistent with your own characteristics. It's sort of the same thing. So it's interesting to me that we now have this different argument, and I wonder whether Virginia could have gotten away with what they did here by just making a classification argument the way that Tennessee is in this case.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, that there is absolutely a parallel between any law that says you can't act inconsistent with a protected characteristic.
This is what you get when you select justices based on race. They're only capable of talking about race. They have to shoehorn every single issue into some racial framework because it's all they know. It got them to this point in their careers, so what else are they going to do? And in this case, not that it really needs to be said, but there is no comparison between Tennessee's ban on child castration and Virginia's long-defunct law banning interracial marriage. For one thing, Virginia's law prevented adults from marrying based on their immutable characteristics, okay? Tennessee's law, as we've already discussed, does not do any of that. It prevents minors from undergoing experimental sex changes, not because of their immutable characteristics, but because these attempts to change their sex are actively harmful to them and also impossible. Okay, they're trying to do an impossible thing. It's an affront to basic biology. Okay, it's a law that's saying you cannot do intentional harm to a child, all in an attempt to bring about a result that is fundamentally impossible. It's not fundamentally impossible for a black person to marry a white person. That's a very possible thing to happen. It is fundamentally impossible for a boy to become a girl. And so any attempt to turn him into one will constitutes abuse in the worst form. As far as I could tell, based on these oral arguments, this is looking like a 6-3 decision in favor of Tennessee. The best the ACLU could hope for is that the Supreme Court somehow finds that this law does indeed discriminate on the basis of sex. And if that happens, the case goes back to the Sixth Circuit for a rerun of their analysis with a slightly higher standard of review of the law. But that outcome also appears to be very unlikely at this point. For the most part, the conservative justices asked good questions, demonstrated their skepticism of gender ideology. There were some moments that raised some eyebrows, like when John Roberts referred to Chase Strangio as Mr., even though she's a female. There's also the fact that no conservative justice directly refuted the unscientific, made-up terminology that the Biden DOJ used, like, for example, a gender assigned at birth and so on. The justices mostly accepted some of the definitions and framings of the activists, which they shouldn't have done. But in general, we got exactly what we wanted. The trans activists appear to be losing this fight, and they know it. We are nearing the culmination of the battle that we began, that really began years and years and years ago. But in terms of this law, that could be one of the catalysts of that was the Vanderbilt expose that we published. All of these activists can do now, all they could do, as they did yesterday, is just scream into the abyss. And in the meantime, we'll continue fighting to ensure that these people won't be able to ruin the life of another child. If this case goes the way we expect it to, it's not the end of the fight. It's the start, actually, of a whole new fight, of an effort to ban this butchery nationwide, and then to defeat gender ideology entirely. We can start by cutting all federal funding to the gender industry, and that'd be a good, easy place to start. Something can be done right away. And from there, we go on with the ultimate goal, a total ban on this practice. So this is a victory that seemed pretty far away just a few years ago. But based on what just happened in the Supreme Court, it's now clear that finally we are very close to achieving it. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.